Hey 5th grade, happy Tuesday. I hope the quiz yesterday went well for you guys. Today and tomorrow we're talking about the American Revolution. So the people that were involved just beforehand, and some of the events that happened right before the American Revolution leading up to the war. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and get started. Today I'm talking about mainly the people of the Revolution. I will include some events because people are not just separated from the events that happened, but tomorrow I'll pare it down more to the events that you really, really need to pay attention to, okay? So, to start off, before we can get anywhere, we have to talk about the Stamp Act. The Stamp Act was passed by Britain when the colonies were still the colonies. In 1765, it was a tax on all printed materials. And then you had to get it. So when you bought a printed material, like even like a magazine, you had to get a stamp on it that said, hey, this person paid their tax. And so the colonists did not like it. And we had Patrick Henry here. Patrick Henry, who made several speeches throughout the time of this and the American Revolution. He made several speeches, and he was one of the first to speak out and be like, no, this is ridiculous. I don't want to pay no taxes. And so he was one of the first ones to speak out about that tax. He gave a really big speech in Williamsburg about this tax to try to get people to stop. Another person involved was Samuel Adams. We got Sam Adams here. He actually helped create, he organized what was called the Sons of Liberty. And the Sons of Liberty burned the stamps that they were supposed to be given for saying that they paid their taxes. And they threatened actually the stamp agents, the people that gave out these stamps, and said, you give out these stamps, we gonna come after you. That's what he did. Later on, they tried to pass the Townshend Act, which created a tariff. A tariff is a tax on all imported goods. Imported goods means it's coming into the country from somewhere else. So in the U.S., at this time, imported goods would have been coming from Britain. And so they tried to put a tax on all imported goods, whether it be clothing, tea, food, whatever the case may be. This was partially for what they were trying to do. Britain was trying to show the colonies who was in charge. They were trying to be like, you two wanna say no to our little taxes? We're gonna show you who's in charge. We're gonna put a tax on all imported goods. But it started backfiring because the colonists were like, we're still not going to pay taxes. And so they started to boycott, which means they refused to buy these goods. They were like, you know what? We are better off without these goods if we're going to have to pay a tax on them. And one of the colonists was actually Mercy Otis Warren, the only female we're going to be talking about today. She encouraged people to not buy these goods. Hey, don't buy these goods. She was an author, and she would write about how people shouldn't buy these goods, and she was one of those that encouraged them to. All right, so moving on. Here's my cat again. Moving on, moving up to 1770 in March is what we have called the Boston Massacre. So the Boston Massacre happened when at the time, British soldiers and colonists were already getting into fights pretty much every day. And so at one point, colonists surrounded the British soldiers. I can't say my SH today, sorry. Soldiers, and the soldiers panicked and shot. They ended up killing 5 people, and it's called a massacre because it was the killing of unarmed people, helpless people, essentially. They killed 5 colonists, and so it's called the Boston Massacre, and that's what happened. And during that time, you had Crispus Attucks. He was a slave who, at the age of 27, escaped slavery, and so he was joining around Boston to help with these protests, to bring more people to protest. And he was one of those that was killed. Now we have another figure. I don't have a thing for him. His name was John Adams. And even though he didn't like the British people, he still thought that they deserved a fair trial, and he defended them in court. And then the courts decided that they weren't guilty of murder. And so moving on, we have what's called committees of correspondence. So all across the colonies, all down the colonies, we ended up having committees of correspondence that would start so that colonies could communicate with each other. But they had to do so fairly quickly, so they got what they called express riders, which were fast horses, essentially. You had people on horses traveling fast to get all these messages to and from each other. And one of those people, I'm sure you can guess who, if it's a fast horse, Paul Revere. Bam, bam. So you had Paul Revere. He was one of these express riders, and he was one of the ones delivering these messages to and from the committees of correspondence. And then later, we'll talk about the fact that he went down the land and we're like, the British are coming, the British are coming. Fast forwarding a little bit, we get to the Boston Tea Party. So after the tariffs didn't work and everything else, Britain decided that to help, sorry, she stuck her claws into me, that to help with both the East India Trading Company and the trying to get taxes for Britain was going to try to make it where the East India Company was the only one that could provide tea. So if you were a colonist trying to sell tea, the only way you could sell tea was through the East India Company. Well, as you can assume, colonists did not like that. And so what happened was they went in one day into the harbor as a shipment was coming in, and they dumped all of that tea into the harbor. So it's called the Boston Tea Party. It happened in Boston, in the Boston Harbor, and they just dumped it all in the harbor as an act of defiance. After all of that happened, they had the First Continental Congress, and this was essentially to vote to stop all trade at all with Britain. All right, and so one of the people that was there was George Washington. Now, he's not president yet because there's no president yet, but he was a representative for Virginia, and he was one of them that voted to stop all trade with Britain. They also voted that the colonies should start militias, which is trained, armed groups of men that would be ready to fight. They didn't have an army or anything, but they had men that were ready and willing to fight if it came down to it. And so later on, as all of that was happening, the British decided that they were going to try to arrest John Hancock and Samuel Adams, who's over here. Sam Adams. John Hancock and Sam Adams, because they're two of the biggest Patriot leaders. And as we know, John Hancock was the one that signed his signature very big on, very largely on the Declaration of Independence when that would happen. All right? And so those are all of our people today. And then tomorrow we're going to get a little bit more into some of the details. But just to recap very quickly, you have, let me get them back in order. So first we had Patrick Henry, who, when the Stamp Act came into place, was like, and he gave a giant speech at Williamsburg that was like, we shouldn't pay no taxes, that's ridiculous. Okay, so we have Patrick Henry. Then you have Sam Adams, who was also against the taxes, and who was also a leader. He organized Sons of Liberty, who would then burn stamps and threaten the people giving the stamps out. All right, next we had Mercy Otis Warren. She was an author, and she supported the boycotts of all these tariffs that were happening. Then we had Paul Revere, who we found out was an express writer for all of the committees of correspondence across all of the colonies, and he would get messages to and from them. We had George Washington, who is not yet president, but would be one day, and he was the representative of Virginia and helped to vote to stop all of the trade with Britain and to train men in all of the colonies in case it came down to a fight. And then John Hancock was another Patriot leader who would later sign the Declaration of Independence, okay? So you have that. You have your assignment today, which is to read about the Founding Fathers and to answer questions about that. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, have a great day.